Hello and welcome to my paper on the Tudeh Party in Britain. I'm very happy to be here. I know it's not Washington DC, but this is a very happy close second. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I just want to sort of give you an idea of where my next research will take me. By way of introduction, my name is Rowena Abdul Razak. I'm at the University of Oxford, and I just resubmitted my thesis, which was on the role of the Tudeh Party in British policy from 1941 to 1946, so essentially covering the British-Soviet occupation of the country. I was very interested in how the British placed the Tudeh within their policy, what kinds of policies were implemented to either counter the Tudeh or at some points also to encourage the Tudeh, and the central question was why the Tudeh wasn't basically adopted by Britain as a way to gain influence in the country. I mean, we can go on about that, so I'll try not to be too sidetracked. So in this paper, and this is actually why I decided to work on this paper, I wanted to move away from British governmental policy, and I was more interested in the British left and what their interactions were with the Tudeh Party, what kinds of activism they wanted to pursue, how did their international solidarity look like, and how they were able to basically cross borders, and how the British left were able to use the Tudeh Party, an Iranian party that really had nothing to do with Britain, and were able to adopt it and adapt it to British circumstances and be used for their own campaigns in 1980s Britain. So just briefly as an introduction, the Tudeh Party was founded in September 1941, just after the British-Soviet occupation of the country and after the abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi. Although they started off as an anti-fascist front, their Marxist leanings were apparent from the very beginning. Most of their members had become Marxists while in prison, more famously known as the Group of 53. Their original leader, Sulaiman Mirza Iskandari, was a part of the original Socialist Party of Iran. So a lot of the backbone of the party were Marxist in origin. They may have downplayed it at the start of the occupation, but it was always there. And but because they were firstly operating under occupation circumstances, they really downplayed their Marxist leanings and instead focused on more a broad cross-section of the society. But by the end of the occupation, by 1945-46, they certainly started to concentrate more on industrial workers, in particular in the south of the country, in oil-rich Khuzestan. So it's from then on that the British started to see the Tudeh as a menace to their oil hegemony, and they started to actively try and undermine the party, especially during the 1946 strikes. But of course, the Tudeh became illegal in 1949, and they were but still nonetheless remained heavily involved in the oil nationalization crisis. But the British left, when I mean the British left, I normally mean the Communist Party of Great Britain, and also the various trade unions and independent groups that sprung up especially throughout the 80s. But in the 1940s, you already got an interest in Iran, especially from the Communist Party of Great Britain. Here are some really fun notes by Rajapal Mehdood, who was the one-time General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And there was a deep interest already on Iran from their side by the late 1940s. I mean, they saw it as a part of, they saw Iran as an essential place of anti-British imperialism. This was a time of independence of India. The 1950s, you saw a huge increase of nationalist uprisings against British presence in the Persian Gulf. For example, in Bahrain, you had a surge of protests against British presence there. And so this was a time of anti-imperialism, and so Iran and the Tudeh Party started to play a role within the British left as an example of those who were actively fighting symbols of British imperialism, in this case the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Now, so And the party started gaining more of an interest in things beyond Iran as well. In 1946, you had demonstrations, two-day demonstrations against General Franco in Spain, for example, which I find quite fascinating. You also started to see the Tudeh establishing contact with communist parties in India, especially among the Indian workers in the south. And then you also had Zionist labor, socialist Zionist labor movements in the south as well, becoming quite active among oil workers. So the Tudeh was starting to see its activism beyond Iran and started to become quite an active, starting to play quite an active role in international solidarity. And of course, once they started becoming more and more suppressed in Iran, they moved out of the country, mainly to the Eastern Bloc, like East Germany. But then you also had the party establish itself in London, known as the Organization of the Tudeh Party of Iran and Britain, or the Sazman Hizb Tudeh Irani Dar Britannia, and they were based in southwest London. And it's mainly from the 70s and 80s that they really start to play an important role from Britain, and London starts to establish itself as another hub for Tudeh politics. Always in close contact with East Germany, which was where the party was mainly headquartered in exile. And so from the 70s, you start to see Iran becoming an important. So there was a move away from Iran as part of the anti-British imperial movement, and becoming more of an area where workers' rights needed to be fought for. And so it worked well with what was happening in Britain at the time. The 1970s and 80s was a time of increasing conservatism, and as well as an increase in trade union politics. And so it kind of fit in very well. And so you have more English publications about workers' rights and interest in working class, about their struggles, about their what they were going through. And so these are some of the examples that you had from the time. And even here you have Tariq Ali providing the foreword of one of the publications, and he was a very famous British communist who has been active until very recently as well. And so the workers started to become a part of this rhetoric. And so you see the British left sort of seeing what was happening in Iran in parallels with what was happening in Britain, and which I find quite fascinating, sort of this ability to move beyond borders and sort of trying to sort of see everything as one, not really, however, taking into account the Iranian condition necessarily, and very much like the socialists, also disregarding the importance of religion and the importance of Islam in the lives of Iranians, and sort of ignoring what they could but taking what they needed, basically. And so from London, the Tudeh also started to publish a news bulletin known as the Tudeh News, and this was distributed around Britain and also to the wider English-speaking world. And it's throughout the 1980s that you see a lot of this, and then they started to use these platforms as a way, firstly, to uphold the revolution. So, where they had been very active against the Shah. So I'm just going to go forward a little bit. So you have things like this from the 1970s, the Confederation of Iranian Students. So the 70s was very much a time of anti-Shah rhetoric, anti-Shah activism, the Shah as a brutal suppressor of Iran. It's the Shah's the Shah's entry in Doha and the Shah's commitment of Iranian troops in Doha, all seen as part of this anti-left regime, basically. And so Britain also played a pretty important role in the Iranian student activist movement as well. So here's quite an interesting letter from the Iranian Student Society about, I think it's about Dhofar actually. They've organized International Dhofar Week as a way to make a stand against the Shah and against US imperialism. So this is the kind of rhetoric that you saw, and it's actually at Imperial College, funny enough. So yeah, these are one of the many places that Iranian students would have been students at, and so that's an example of that. And then you have throughout the 70s also these kinds of publications coming out, sort of seeing the Tudeh as, again, a vanguard of the Iranian workers' movement. And these were published as a way to, provide information, but also to really establish themselves as a workers' party. Again, this was the 70s, and this was I think some of these publications may have already been in the 80s. This was also trying to link in with what was happening in Britain, with the rise of Thatcherism and all these workers' strikes that were happening at the same time. So what you really saw was a very happy marriage of campaigns, and these were the results of them. And also you have also about Iranian women as well, and it's quite the one on the right here is actually quite an interesting pamphlet about women's rights, and with very interesting and actually beautifully drawn pictures. Anyway, that's for another matter. But so this idea that the Tudeh was standing for workers' rights, women's rights, these causes which were effectively sidelined mainly after the revolution. So you see the Tudeh stepping in, and the British left also taking very much into consideration what was happening and really adopting what the Tudeh causes as their own. So the 1980s, after the overthrow of the Shah, the Tudeh saw itself as successful, of course, but realized that the heroic revolution wasn't going to last. Although they saw it as initially a success of ousting a US and Western imperialist figure, which was Mohammad Reza Shah. They also initially actually regarded the Islamic Republic as an important anti-imperialist stage of the revolution. And so they used to portray the Islamic Republic as such. And in its 1981 program, they wanted to establish socialism and to expand abroad. Again, this idea that it needed to move beyond. And so after the 1980s, with the Iran-Iraq War and the further suppression of the left in Iran throughout the 1980s, it was almost like a repeat show of what had happened under the Shah's regime. So the British left saw Iran again as a cause to take on, and you see a lot of trade unions in Britain taking on the Iranian cause, and sort of trying to use Iran as a way to gain more support, but to also show that what was happening in Britain was not unique, and that there were others out there suffering under a right-wing conservative government. So it kind of worked out well. So you had, for example, a few committees that were set up as well during the 1980s. You have CODER, which is, I think, the Confederation of, hang on, I can't remember the name now. Sorry, excuse me, it was the Committee for the Defense of the Iranian Revolution in 1981, and this really reflected where the British workers and the British left were at. From 1985 to, in the mid-1980s, you had an increase of workers' strikes, the miners' strikes, especially under Margaret Thatcher, and so you had this idea that the British workers were alone. And having the Iranian workers stand side by side, sort of trying to promote this international solidarity, it made Britain feel less alone, and also that there was a wider cause to fight. And I think that's fascinating, and also sort of in their rhetoric, showing that the Iranian workers were a key component of the revolution, was also very very key to the British left. And so you had things like Codir, which was established, I think I said, in 1981. And in their flyer, I don't know if you can actually see it, but they would have written something like, "You fight for peace and social justice in Britain, you should want the same for Iranians." So evoking this idea that their cause was beyond borders, wasn't an international one, really evoked a sense of shared responsibility over events everywhere. So, and then here on the right as well, you have the Jack Dunn, who was the General Secretary for the National Union of Mine Workers, chairing a meeting on Iran as well. So this idea, these campaigns were very key to what was happening in Britain as well. And then, of course, interjected with this was the Tudeh also trying to not lose relevance. So you have the party establishing a celebration of its foundation, trying to get this idea that they were still very relevant and still there. So these were, you have, this is for a party, I think this is for the 46th anniversary of the foundation of the Tudeh Party, and I like the idea of a revolutionary choir. The Tudeh actually had quite a lot of music as part of their campaigning in the late 1940s. In the mid 1940s, you had Tudeh anthems being sung by actually Indian workers, and this is quite well recorded by the Iranian Ministry of Interior, where Indian workers would be singing Tudeh anthems in places like Qom during the 1946 oil strikes. And if please feel free to ask if you need more information on that. I can happily provide that. So yeah, and so this idea that that the Tudeh also needed to remain relevant in the 1980s. So Britain was able to take on the cause of the Iranian left, and the Tudeh, and then you also had the Tudeh from its safe space, from its relatively safe space in Britain, trying to maintain its relevance. So the 1980s was almost crucial for the Tudeh. But what you did see was, as the British left were taking on the cause of Iran, it almost felt like the Tudeh was feeling more and more isolated. So you did have a brief moment where the Tudeh was together with the Fedayeen just trying to galvanize support for their joint cause, and in light of decreasing relevance and also their impending defeat in Iran with heavy suppressions throughout the 1980s. And so yeah, then you have these kind of really, as the late 80s became more dark for the Iranian left, their campaigns started to shift to sort of showing these quite I'm sorry, these images I realize are quite disturbing, but the campaign started to shift from workers to more look what's happening to the Iranian left. So their campaign started to change and showing graphic imagery of what was happening to Iranian communists and Iranian left-wing members back in Iran. So all the suppressions actually led the Communist Party of Great Britain to take an even more obvious stand. And here's an example of it, where the district secretary of the London District Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, he wrote directly to Ayatollah Khomeini in 1983, basically standing up for the Tudeh Party, and specifically the Tudeh Party, and also writing in defense of Nuruddin Khanuri, who had been arrested. So this idea that the British left had to do something, I think it's pretty obvious here. So taking on this cause was very important to them, and again using this idea and this rhetoric that it's a struggle against imperialism, trying to really capture what was the spirit of the revolution. So this was an interesting example of the Communist Party of Great Britain trying to engage with the Republic, trying to also make a proper stand against for the Tudeh. And it's interesting as well to see, how the Tudeh had adopted British rhetoric, using words like imperialism, reaction in their writings as a way to stand side by side the British cause and the British language of struggle, as it were. I realize this has been quite a broad and maybe slightly superficial sweep of the Today in Britain, and I think that it's still worthy of a little bit more interest and more research, definitely. And there's a lot we can say about the Today in Britain, and particularly about the British interest in the Today and the Iranian left. What interests me is really how we can actually apply Orientalism to the British left and their idea that, Iran needed to be saved, that the Iranian workers needed to be rescued in some way or another. So that's something that I'm really trying to get my head around, and so I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments, and I appreciate your listening and your attention. Please let me know if there's anything you need to clarify in any way. Thank you so much.